Hello, unconventional founders, and welcome to The Founder's Truth, a conversation with Carlo Mahfouz and guests. Episode 7 welcomes Satish Shenoy, business transformation expert with AI and automation, partner ecosystems builder, and author of Runaway Growth. As we explore the founder's inner reality, why most teams' culture is performance theater, and what AI actually threatens in us.
All right, Carlo. Really excited to hear about the trilogy and the 3 books coming. I think it's an amazing experience for anybody, really leveraging your books and making this happen. So, if a founder executes your framework of all 3 books
Yes?
perfectly, right? Finds and builds the right team culture, integrates AI just like they should, and they still fail,
Uh-huh.
what's outside the scope of your trilogy?
Excellent question. What's outside the scope of my trilogy? So, the trilogy, in some ways, is not promising success or failure, interestingly. Instead, it's promising how to navigate success and failure, regardless of the outcomes. So, and a lot of the times, we look at founding a company or creating a new idea from scratch or sharing that as if, that's kind of the end goal, the outcome we're looking for it. If anything, especially in reality check, where we focus on the founder's outlook and how they are seeing these challenges or what questions they're asking to realize whether it's a failure or a success, the key is allowing them to recognize what the moment itself in that circumstances is both negative or positive, and as a result of that, what opportunities come along. So it is almost out of scope in it's successful or failed, yet at the same time it's a matter of definition. Like, so how do you define a venture as successful? Is it the first time you fail to capture a client, or you fail to enter a new market, or is it after a few tries? How much time do you give it? Like, so all of these things. But what I think is really powerful in the trilogy, it's actually not trying to work within those, because I think the outcomes could vary significantly. Yet, how can you leverage any of those outcomes to continue the journey without burnout or feeling alone or feeling, drained to a certain extent?
Got it. Oh, that's interesting. Because sometimes what I find is founders are squarely focused on, their startup growing, or, something very, almost short term, almost, it's revenue or else kind of, that kind of approach, right? So maybe stating that up front or somehow making that clear might be helpful. Now, the trilogy, you spoke about the founder, starting with the founder with
Yeah.
reality check. So the trilogy moves from the founder to the team to the technology or society. But many founders argue or may argue that you need to start with the problem slash market, right? It's all about product market fit and not yourself.
Yes.
Why is your sequence the right one?
Another great questions. So, how do you recognize what is the problem to solve in the first place? If you're not able to do the inner work of how you see the world and how you see what is shaping the problems, or what is key to the different areas you want to tackle, how do you actually go about it? So it's interesting that always people look at outside, look at the market, look at what's problem to solve, etc. But what ends up happening is a lot of trial and error, because a lot of the inner work and you recognizing what is, first off, what is possible for you to do based on the current circumstances that you are in, to a certain extent. That means, like, what are the channels that you can leverage? What are the existing connections that you have? All of these things, which require a lot of actually more awareness on, what is true to you today, which allows you to enter, and what needs to be true tomorrow to help you get there. So I would argue in most cases, you cannot even recognize the right problem to solve almost, or ask the questions that allow you to surface that problem if you are still stuck to a certain extent with your own filters and biases or preconceptions of what that may look like.
Let's bring it down to a specific example. I used to work
Yes.
for a startup
Yes.
where the founder was afraid to travel in planes.
Yeah.
He felt it was very claustrophobic. He didn't want to travel at all as a result. So he created a tool that allowed for um, distance collaboration. It became the market standard. I mean, it
Yeah.
became hugely successful. He became a billionaire. I used to work for him, right? So all that. So I think of um, that situation where he didn't necessarily need to know about himself.
Mm-hmm.
He knew that this was a problem that he wanted to solve. How do I rationalize that in, with taking your response? As you were responding, I was thinking about that startup founder,
Mm-hmm.
and I was thinking about how this would apply, how he would react to something like this.
It's a perfect example. I'm gonna map it on how reality check, like mirrors that. What
Yeah.
he did is he was able to recognize a problem that he had. It was his problem that he had. He was struggling to fly. He was able to understand the limitations and what that created for him, and he was
Mm.
able to accept it to move forward through it. And like, if anything, that required an extreme clarity on his behalf and understanding the problem that he's facing and the
Mhm.
way he has to go about it.
Mm.
Anyone else could have that same problem of fear of flight to a certain extent, and yet doesn't have the clarity around it, which requires a lot of, I would say, personal. It's very easy to know. A lot of people cannot fly. Why? A lot of them basically did not create a solution for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, that helps. Bringing it down to an example, I think really helps. So, I am much more clear now as to why that starts with you first, and then right. Um, I got one of your statements you made. I think either in a post or so on. I remember you saying most of what we have been taught about startups is performance theater. And I see it, by the way. I see it in a lot of startups. But some of that theater has actually built successful companies. How do you distinguish between um, useful conventions and harmful BS, like you've called it?
um, so I don't believe there is ever one way to approach something, to be fair, right? And what I find always is interesting is retrospectively when we look at something, we analyze it and judge it very different than when it's happening in the moment. So a lot of these companies, to a certain extent, it's very hard to really make the separations and the connections and like kind of, did they follow this path and was that path successful? I actually find that most of the time misleading. So especially when you talk to founders who actually succeeded, when they
Yeah.
are retrospectively looking at their journey, they kind of pick and choose what they feel defined it to a certain extent. And by that choice, there's a bias inherent in it to a certain extent. And when others
Mm.
try to mirror it, they are almost mirroring the choices that founder decided is the inflections point, not necessarily what really happened.
Without
And
also making it personalized, right? It's
yeah.
everybody's, yeah.
So of course it's personalized because the context is gonna keep changing for everyone. It's very different. So it's very hard. That's why I don't look at success and failure in that, because it's always a story or a narrative that you're telling based on what kind of things you feel were the
Mhm.
defining moments. And a lot of the
Mm.
times we ignore the true defining moments because they are quite vulnerable and there's a certain level of insecurity that comes with them, while we sugarcoat or polish the journey in a way, because first off, it makes a better story to make others like feel, part of it. But at the same time, because inherently and unconsciously to a certain extent, we are reflecting what we want out of the journey, not what the journey was exactly. And I think that has created probably one of the biggest problems in founders' journey, is where, they they try to mirror others, but they're trying to mirror the narrative of others, not necessarily as the journey it is, because very, very few people, I would say, can speak to how they came to be to the level, especially when you're in it. And I feel like that's always the different things. It's one thing that you are in that moment, in that struggle, in the lack of finances, and all of that, and dealing with these things on the fly. It's another when you are in a much better position and reflecting back on that position. You're not the same person anymore.
True.
And we
Yeah,
tell
you've
that
gone
story
through the.
always from the vantage point of the person who's in the future, not from the vantage point of the person who's in it right now.
Yeah, you're a different person because you've gone through that experience and
Exactly.
other experiences, and yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So let's deal with the books, the trilogy itself now. Okay, so I've read book one, right? Reality check. I know it's changing. Um, you you described this beautifully. Sitting with ambiguity to find clarity, which is very paradoxical, as we know. What's the and I was thinking about this in my context when I was part of a young seed stage startup. I was not the founder, but I was one in the founding team, so I could relate to the founder. What's the biggest mistake that founders make when they are trying to force clarity a little too early? Can you and and interestingly, can you give me an example of a founder who got it just right?
Okay. Interesting. I think there's, I'm going to answer this question in two ways. I see it. First off, I think there is, the thing is, everyone is asking you usually, especially early stage, clarity. Like, what is your target audience? How you're solving that problem, etc. Like all of this clarity conversation is always kind of almost takes the whole stage. Yet, a lot of the times, what people end up being evaluated on, especially whether they're getting funding or customer trusting them to a certain extent, is not
Yeah.
actually the level of clarity that they're highlighting, but to a certain extent, the vulnerability and authenticity and how they showcased it. Because a lot of the times, even when you were talking about a founder coming in any pipeline, you're looking at the person, not necessarily only the problem and the clarity. And I think what's interesting about being extremely focused and extremely clear on what you are doing, it means in some ways that problem has already been solved or that market has already been captured. If the level of clarity is extremely high initially, which means that the level of competition that you're going into is relatively very high. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of people kind of conflate these things. So that does not mean, though, and this is where the interesting thing is, you can have clarity on your ambitions and intentions and understanding how much of ambiguity still exists in them. That's a clarity too, right? And that's why I always say there is always ambiguity will always be there. It's the fact that sometimes we dismiss its existence or we try to remove it completely. And when we remove it completely, we're ignoring a lot of things that are kind of happening or relevant. Probably a good example of that is, we talk about innovation a lot of the times, and as if, innovation is the kind of, as if innovation is the really most important part of any founders. But if you see the businesses usually which actually do the best early on are the ones who are solving very basic problems. In most cases, like it's like digitization, like right, moving from paper to make it much more easy. So if you look at it, a lot of the times it's nothing like revolutionary, and yet at the same time is revolutionary. It's like seeing in between where are these gaps and making sure those gaps kind of become smoother and like much easier to access. And in that regard, I think that requires, a lot of understanding, but at the same time, a lot of kind of recognizing where you are today. Because if you jump too far ahead as well and something being revolution, like the market is not ready for. And I think that's
Yeah.
a lot of the times what ended up happening. And to me, especially, going through the book authorship and all of this, I've realized like it's how easy it is to just jump ahead. Like, right, you have like amazing ideas or etc. and jump way after the market is ready to actually even understand
Can,
where you are.
can I ask you though, in that sense,
Yes.
see, most founders want to solve difficult problems.
Yes.
If the problem that I think there's this tension between having been part of early stage startups. I see this tension. I want to solve a problem that is not easy to solve.
Mm-hmm.
I want to innovate because if I pick an easier problem to solve, everybody else will solve it, and
Yeah.
then I'm living in a red ocean. But I want to be in a good blue ocean, etc. Right? So, but then I want to solve something that could be leaping forward, like when Steve Jobs brought the iPhone. He was thinking ahead of what even the customers needed. So how do you rationalize that? Something like that, where it was an innovation that was far ahead of its time in some ways because nobody else had done anything close to it.
I think that's very interesting. I think two things in that regard. One is if it's something is very difficult, recognizing is that very difficult should come with understanding what are the foundations to make that very difficult come to bear, right? So let's say it's not a problem that you have an idea which is really difficult to execute on and you want to solve it. The problem
Mhm,
usually is like how fast you want to solve it, how much
mhm,
money you want to throw at it, how much education you want to educate the audience or like your customers before they actually can buy into it. And a lot of the
mhm,
time we jump on these basic steps, assuming that like everyone is gonna recognize this overnight. And
mhm,
it takes a very long period of time before that happens. And in the example of I think the iPhone specifically and Steve Jobs, a lot of those foundational pieces existed before he came up with the iPhone, right? The technology was almost there. There was already a lot of tablets that have been in the market. Like, right, his innovation was that the interface is the full screen. That was the shift. But a lot of the foundational pieces were already there, and the market was in a much better state to get there. And as well, the company had enough clout to
mhm,
basically present something like that, and already has the audience to kind of or like the customer to capture it. And
mhm,
the problem is a lot of the times founders miss that all of these pieces need to be there. Like, right, a product or an idea is not enough. The right channels that you have, how many of those channels, how much trust you already have with the customers, can you reach them easily? How you're going to educate them? Like all of those things are actually key foundational pillars for that. That's why a lot in the second book we talk about the ecosystem of the founder, which is the team that you're working with, but the team around you, which is basically behind the scenes, whether advisors or supporters or like there is a team which is much bigger that creates the founder ecosystem, which a lot of the times I think when a founder reaches success, dismisses that whole ecosystem as like that didn't exist. I did it on my own, which I think is one of the biggest BS ever. the, you know, I, and
yeah,
I think that's the disconnect. Again, to the story we were talking about earlier, the disconnect is a little bit is one that founder arrives. They usually says like I did it almost alone, and the thing is
yeah,
they never really did it alone.
yeah.
They've leveraged so many things in their current circumstances, whether people or circumstances or positioning or technology. They leverage all of those things to get there, and
Mhm.
that cannot be undermined. And I think those are key pillars which are usually almost always like kind of cut out of the story.
That's true. I've seen it. I can think of an example too. Um, so talking about book two,
Yeah.
so you talk about optimizing the wrong things. I mean, I
Yes.
think there's a couple of examples we might have already covered, but what's the most common example of teams optimizing the wrong tenants that you've seen? And then what should they optimize for instead? Is there a practical example you can give us?
Yeah. So, I mean, typically now these days we talk about like OKRs and KPIs and objective and performance metric for teams, like, right? And how they're operating and what's their velocity and all of this stuff, which, in hindsight is not necessarily bad on its own. The problem is what ends up happening is when we start optimizing for that, we forget what the true value of that meeting was supposed to be. You meet with others to collaborate, and based on that collaboration, come to some solutioning or understanding. The collaboration is the key. It's not actually, coming in and setting an agenda and making sure, I already have where I need to go and all of those things. So it's fascinating a lot. And that's just what we're talking about, the team that, you're managing or you are within. In a lot of ways, the value of a team is actually when they come together, they're able to communicate and listen to each other. They are able to be vulnerable enough in exposing the issues that needs to be discussed, and that there is room for that space. And we talk about psychological safety and like all of those things, like, right? But what is fascinating is we talk about these things, but these things we observe them when they're happening. We don't build for them. Because the worst thing I see happening is, okay, now we have psychological safety, as if it's like a flip of a switch, like, right, turn it on, turn it off kind of deal, which I think is the biggest BS ever. It just doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
And this is where actually probably part of ambiguity comes into play, because if everyone, like, let's say, everyone on that table is coming already with their mind made, or to a certain extent know what they want, so they have clarity on what, then there is no conversation to be had.
Yeah.
There is nothing, because you've already come and, whether consciously or unconsciously, you're going to either just manipulate the conversation to get what you want, or you stop listening to others or you're just trying to make the case for the ideas that you bring, rather than actually having, I think conversations are one of the most fragile things when they're done right. Like a meaningful dialogue is a very fragile thing. It requires a lot of, like, I would say, fuzzy edges and openings for it actually to kind of slide through different people. And if that doesn't happen, then it's actually no longer a conversation. Then it's a webinar. Like, you're just coming and preaching. And usually what ends up happening is, like, you have 5 people come to the meeting and they're all preaching. So it's useless.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well said. That's actually a very good example. We see it often, happen quite a bit. So one of the things that caught my attention in book 2 that you had mentioned is this whole idea of absurdity.
Yeah.
The absurd in team dynamics. What's an example where the conventional wisdom about teams is completely backwards or absurd, you'd say?
I think probably one of I think the worst that I see is, everyone wants like a certain level of transparency in the conversation. Like, they want everyone to be open and etc. Yet at the same time, every single incentive is optimized against that. Meaning, like, right, we do individual metrics. So we're measuring your performance, not the collective outcome performance, right? We're measuring, how fast you go as an efficiency metric, but we don't measure, like, so if you spend more time on this, how many meetings, like, it ends up all the incentives that are shaping to a certain extent, the conversation to go well, and for you to have the opening to be transparent, actually don't exist. Actually, they're all working against you. And in some way, I feel like absurdity here plays a bigger part even. If you go into every conversation extremely serious, in the sense that everything is like the holy grail, there is no conversation to be had as well. Like, if there is not an air of lightness in how the dialogue end up happening, which honestly we don't measure these things. If anything, if anyone like drew that, but like, always remember that if you had someone who's like almost very, not necessarily cheerful and positive, but like kind of
Mhm.
lighthearted. Like they bring, things, they bring them and they're discussing them, but with a certain level of even absurdity to them. Like they know this might be ridiculous and how I'm shaping it, but like, let's, play with it a little bit. Automatically, the dynamic of the conversation changes. It's no longer about,
True.
I'm trying to tell you this is how I want to do it. This is more of like kind of let's play with it and see where we go. And
Yeah.
suddenly, but we don't
There's a
optimize for
freedom.
that, like, right? Because that goes against the efficiency.
No, there's a freedom in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's beautiful. Beautifully described, actually. Now, the other thing that caught my attention, Carlo, is you talk about destroying the barriers, right?
Yeah.
Moving on to actually, now I'm moving on to quickly on to book 3, which is
Yes.
about AI. That would probably be my favorite book, given where I come from. But you talk about destroying the barriers, right, between human and digital or synthetic. What I've seen in my experience
Yeah.
is, in speaking to all these people that are running AI initiatives at a lot of companies, etc., and are responsible for the outcomes, they're concerned about losing our humanity to AI. At least some of them are.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a tension between human and AI, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so how do you respond to that tension? What are they missing that could help them?
Thank you so much for listening to The Founder's Truth, a space for opening your mind to new possibilities and thinking. One question to reflect on is, if you stripped away your polished founder story, what truth about your real circumstances would you have to face? Our conversation with Satish will continue in the next episode as we dive further into the applications of how the founder's truth work and bring more tangible examples to you.